Started. Welcome everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar here at Frederickson and Byron of doing business in Latin America in the age of COVID-19. We're excited to have Pat Kelly, Luis Resendez, and Rich Weiner to present on 3 different geographical areas dealing with the age of COVID in Latin America. Today, during the presentation, if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A functionality to ask your questions as well. We will be monitoring that Q&A in the chat functionality for questions. If you have a specific question for a specific presenter, please indicate which presenter or which geographic area the question is aimed at. And then afterwards, we'll be presenting a quick networking and connection tip for LinkedIn. So be sure to stay tuned for the very end of the presentation, and we will get you a nice little networking tool to use with your LinkedIn app. So if you have the LinkedIn app on your phone, you will need to access it towards the end of the presentation. Until then, we will be presenting the content. And again, if you have any questions, please enter those into the Q&A or chat functionality. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Luis.
Thank you, Rich. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Luis Resendez, and I'm going to be talking about Mexico specifically. I'm going to try to do this presentation very practical. I'm going to try not to be too lawyery about what we're going to be talking about. And I will invite the audience to please ask questions. Obviously, this will help you if it's touching on things that are important to you. So that's the main purpose of this presentation, to make sure that you get something out of it. First thing is we need to determine what activities are permitted to be conducted in Mexico right now. As many of you may know, Mexico it's farther behind than the US in terms of what companies, what businesses can do in Mexico. And there are some rumors that things that might not get anywhere back to any kind of normal until October or November of this year. So that's why I wanted to start here, to make sure that we understand that while we would like to get things going and get everybody working again and all the economic activity to resume, that's not the case. What do you need to determine what is permitted or not? You obviously need to look at the rules. There are basically 3 sets of rules. There is there are federal rules, state and local. Under the federal, which kind of encompasses all of Mexico and is the one that has provided more detail right now, the federal government has implemented what is called a traffic light system, which consists of a map that is published by the federal government showing different parts of the country in different colors. The colors are red, orange, yellow, or green. If it's in red, the only activities that are permitted are those that are considered essential. If it is orange, then non-essential activities can also resume, but they are limited to 30% to 30% capacity. Yellow and green are okay to perform pretty much all activities, obviously following all of the guidelines to try to protect the health of everybody. What are those guidelines? The Mexican government, the federal government, has published many different orders throughout the last few months. I will advise you, if you want to kind of go to the more comprehensive, to look at the guidelines that were published on in Mexico's official Gazette on May 29. Those guidelines will have very extensive rules on what has to be done to go back to work safely. And what those rules, those are very extensive, but it kind of boils down to number one, you have to determine, are you essential or not essential? If you are essential, you have to do a filing with the Social Security Administration, in which you will tell the Social Security Administration the protocols, the guidelines that you are implementing to ensure the safety of everybody. If you are non-essential, then you have to look at what activities you are going to be conducting and what size you are going to be, and what size is your company. And based on that, then you need to comply with the rules that apply to you. In addition to that, many states have issued their own guidelines, and they are actually, there are some states, Tamaulipas, Baja California, Chihuahua, many states that are actually very active on enforcing those. So you also have to be mindful of those restrictions. And even some municipalities, Tijuana is one example, that have come up with some rules that you also have to follow. So again, that's the first thing that you need to kind of look at. What is it that you can do? In this era, businesses must be flexible and creative. And this applies to many different aspects of conducting businesses in Mexico, but I'm going to touch only a couple of areas. The first one is on the contracting side. This pandemic has created a lot of unforeseeable non-performance, or has created a lot of hardships for parties to perform their obligations on their existing contracts. So what do you do if you are in that situation? First thing that you do is you look at your contract and see if your contract says anything about what happens in those situations. If it does, then great, you have a good guideline. If it doesn't, which is fairly common, a lot of times parties conduct businesses without written or without very well-detailed contracts. That is the reality of commerce. If it doesn't, then you look at, well, is this something that can qualify as an act of God or force majeure? Maybe, although in Mexico, to qualify, it's pretty hard. The elements are for this to consider either an act of God or a force majeure that will excuse performance under a contract is the event has to render performance impossible, making it really hard, making it really expensive is not enough. It has to be impossible. It has to have been unpredictable, and it has to affect everybody that is in the same group. It cannot affect only you. It can affect everybody that is in the same circumstances as you are. There are some other elements that might be analyzed, but these are kind of the majors. Once you have done that analysis, my recommendation is talk to the other party. If you are having issues performing, or if your counterparty is not able to perform, talk to them. This pandemic has made everybody understand that they need to be flexible, that they need to be mindful that it's not that parties are not underperforming or not performing because they want to, but because it has become really hard. So once you have the elements, once you know where you are, where you stand, talk to the other party. And regarding future contracts, this hopefully will be a lesson that will last for a long time, and we need to be better prepared. We need to make sure that our contracts, when the situation allows to have a written contract, that we provide for situations like this. Unfortunately, what we have seen is not many contracts will cover the situation that we currently have. The economic realities, the only thing that I wanted to highlight there is, obviously, this affects everybody differently. If you are the party that is unable to perform, your situation is very different from the party that is on the other side. So you have to take that into account to see what is the best course of action for you to take. Labor and employment, I'm sure that many of you are aware Mexico has a labor law that is very protective from employees. However, in this situation, the rules, although the law was not amended, it's being applied a lot more flexibly. Under normal circumstances, having a situation like this, where the employees are not able to come to work because of the pandemic, you will still be obligated to, most likely you will still be obligated to continue paying them, and there will not be much you could do about it. Under this, however, now we are seeing that many employers have approached their employees and have negotiated something along the lines of they come to work only a few days a week or only 1 week and not the other, and they have made arrangements on the payment. And you can be very creative on what you do on those arrangements. And employees understand that if they want to keep the workplace, that they will have to be flexible too. I'm not advocating that you do this. I'm saying that if you have to do this because your business is just not making it, again, this is an option. I put a note here on Social Security contributions because one thing that has been happening is when employers and employees enter into these kind of situations, Social Security has been taking the position in some instances that they still have to receive the full Social Security contribution. We disagree. We think that under the law, if you take the appropriate steps, those contributions could be reduced. And as many of you, I'm sure know, those contributions can be pretty heavy in Mexico. So that's one thing that to keep in mind. How you go about negotiating those things, one of the first thing that you need to know is whether you have a union or not. If you have a union and you have a good relationship with the union, go through the union. That'll be faster, that'll be easier usually. Mexico has not suffered really any restrictions on foreign trade. Customs are still letting things in and out without many glitches. So that's one thing. And there is an area of opportunity. There is, and I agree with this, there is a belief that Mexico will be, after we are over this current crisis, that Mexico may actually become a more strategic partner of the U.S. Remember that a lot of the things that we consume in the U.S. are coming from China. Well, now with the situation which has been exacerbated by COVID-19, we believe that a lot of the companies will turn to Mexico to strengthen their supply chain. Regulatory issues, a lot of the government offices are still closed or working remotely or working only part-time. So you need to take this into account because things are taking longer to get any kind of governmental approvals. Very quickly on taxes, unfortunately, the Mexican government is going to be strapped for cash for the foreseeable future. The oil situation is not helping. A lot of the revenues for the federal government come from oil, and with the oil prices, that was the first hit, and then this COVID-19 crisis hit. So we have seen that the government has taken more steps to try to police more on the revenue side. One of the things that they have been doing that is very important to keep in mind, now they are going to start using this tool of suspending or even revoking the digital seal. For those of you who don't know, the digital seal, it's an element that is absolutely necessary for businesses to be able to generate invoices in Mexico. So without that invoice, it'll be really hard to do business. The Mexican government has also implemented new informational filings. Again, all of this is geared towards trying to capture more revenue from hopefully more sources. There have been some issues, and this is not something new, but we have seen this continue. There have been some issues with getting bad refunds. The recommendation there is make sure that you have all of your documents, all of your information in place, because if you do not, then when there is a refusal to refund VAT, it'll be hard for you to recover that VAT. So again, make sure that all of your paperwork is in effect. On the flip side of that, there are companies taking a more aggressive tax planning strategy, and there are a few reputable firms that are advising on these things, on this tax planning, and it's not legit. It's just, again, it's more aggressive than we have seen over the last couple of years. I have only 1 minute left, so I'll cover this very quickly. As I mentioned at the beginning, with this crisis, many of the states issued their own rules. For those of you that have been doing business in Mexico for a while, you know that most of the things in Mexico are dictated by the federal government. This crisis changed this. Now, we expect that after this, it will not be restricted to what business can be open, what requirements they need to meet, that states are going to become more assertive on issuing more regulations on more matters. So that's something that we believe is going to change permanently as a result of COVID-19. The takeaways, you need to be more aggressive, more thoughtful on planning and decision making. But please do not take that or any of the comments that I made to interpret those as you should be breaking the rules. No, you can do a lot of planning and be more aggressive and push the envelope a little bit, but still stay within the rules. With that, I pass this along to Rich.
Thanks, Luis. Thank you. And thank you, Rich, for that nice introduction. As Rich mentioned, my name is Richard Weiner, and I'm an attorney in the international group here at Frederickson & Byron. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes today talking about trends that we've seen in Brazil since the coronavirus hit. So I've been watching what we've been doing here in the office, hearing about other reports, or reading up on articles, etc. And I see three trends. Contractual trends, governmental trends, and economic trends, and I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about each one of those. So I'd like to start with contractual issues. So since the coronavirus hit here and in Brazil, we've seen a number of Brazilian companies simply trying to walk away from their deals, reneging on their performance. So this would be for contracts where an American company and a Brazilian company have already signed, entered into the contract. They're in the process, in the midst of performing obligations. And due to the coronavirus and the ensuing economic downturn in Brazil, some Brazilian companies are trying to walk away. And they're doing so somewhat successfully for some of the reasons that Luis mentioned in Mexico. And the first one is, of course, force majeure. I won't repeat what Luis said, but force majeure event under Brazilian law is pretty similar. It's an event that occurs that's unforeseen on the date of the signing of the agreement. Excuse me. not in the control of either of the parties, which renders it virtually impossible for one or both of the parties to perform their obligations under the contract. And so we've seen Brazilian parties simply say, the coronavirus, I've had to cut my staff, I have reduced resources, I have reduced financial capacity, and I have to invoke force majeure. And the Brazilian courts have been pretty sympathetic toward that because, as you can imagine, the coronavirus was, at least for contracts previous to 2020, the coronavirus was indeed unforeseeable by either party and out of everyone's control, and therefore the Brazilian party couldn't control what happened and can't perform, and makes it impossible for them to perform under the contract. We've seen a couple of courts push back a little in Brazil and say, yes, of course this was unforeseeable on the date of signing of the contract, but it wasn't really completely out of your control. You saw the coronavirus spreading around the world. You saw it coming to Brazil. Brazil wasn't the first place it came. You could have, before it hit Brazil, you could have sped up your performance. You could have allocated more staff or more resources to performing your obligations. Now, that's obviously a minority view, but we have seen some of that, a little bit of pushback from the Brazilian courts on that, not willing to automatically accept force majeure as a defense by a Brazilian company that wants to walk away from an existing contract. We've also seen Brazilian companies simply declare bankruptcy, claim that they're going insolvent because of the ensuing economic downturn in the country as a result of the coronavirus. And for that, really, if it's in the contract that either party can walk away if one of the parties files for bankruptcy, becomes insolvent, can't pay its debts as they accrue, all of that, then the Brazilian party is indeed entitled to terminate the agreement. But there are some companies in Brazil that are not going bankrupt and not going insolvent and are not invoking force majeure. And they're simply saying, well, look, we have a reduced staff, we have reduced resources, we have reduced financing. Well, now we have to pick and choose which contracts we want to perform. We're just going to have to let some of them go by the wayside. And yours, unfortunately, American company, yours, unfortunately, happens to be one. And so, yes, we're in breach. We admit it. We are in violation of the contract. And you know what? We're walking away. We're sorry, but there's nothing we can do about that. And if you're not happy, and we're sure you're not, but if you're not happy, well, come on down and sue me. Come to Brazil, file a lawsuit, and see where that gets you. And unfortunately, similar to Mexico, things have slowed down quite a bit in Brazil, including in the Brazilian court system. And unfortunately, you can't run to the courts here in the US and get a US court decree and try to enforce it automatically in Brazil. You can't enforce it automatically in Brazil. So for some American companies, many American companies in this situation, the only solution really is to think about going to Brazil and filing a lawsuit in Brazil. But that, with the delay and the economic downturn, the delay in the court procedures in Brazil, this could take a long time. Either they're shut down, they're on skeleton staff, things are very slow. It could be months, years before any possibility of relief might take place under a claim for a breach of contract in Brazil. But some Brazilian companies are not reneging on their deals. They're not walking away. But what they are doing is they're using the coronavirus as leverage to try to renegotiate some of the terms and conditions in the deals that they've already entered into. And so we're seeing some of that in some of the basic terms and conditions. The Brazilian party is stepping up and saying, look, I don't want to terminate, but I've only got half my staff now. And if I'm going to allocate a lot of my resources to you, yes, I said in this contract the price would be $1 million, but I can't do it for $1 million anymore because I'm going to have to move a lot of my resources and my staff to you and let some of the other contracts go by the wayside. So I'm going to have to charge you $2 million instead. So there's a rediscussion, a renegotiation of the price. And we're seeing that with a lot of things. Warranty periods, for example. Companies are saying, yes, I gave you a 5-year warranty, but I don't have a service department left. And I can't manufacture fast enough to replace any defective parts or any defective equipment. So I can't give you that 5-year warranty period I agreed to in the original contract. I'll give you a 1-year warranty period. So we're seeing some of that. And we're seeing also some Brazilian companies come back and say, look, I need to renegotiate my cap on liability. So yes, this was a $5 million contract, and yes, in the contract we agreed that my exposure as a Brazilian company, my cap on liability would be $5 million, but I don't even have $5 million anymore because of the current situation, the economic downturn. So we need to renegotiate that. I can't cap my exposure at $5 million. I can't live with that. I've got to bring it down, let's say, to $1 million. So let's reduce my exposure, my cap on liability from 5 million down to 1 million. And then we're finally seeing, as I said before, a very slow process for resolution of disputes, whether that's arbitration in Brazil, which has slowed down quite a bit, or filing a lawsuit in the court system in Brazil, that's also slowed down quite a bit. So getting relief anytime soon as a complaining party coming from the United States could be a long time in coming. So then I want to switch a little bit and talk about some of the governmental issues that I've seen and I've read about. So first of all, the movement of goods. So here, there's been a real dichotomy in Brazil between goods that are essential in combating COVID-19 and those that are not. So as you may be aware, Brazil is suffering almost as badly as we are in the US for number of infected cases and number of deaths. I think the US is number 1, but at present Brazil is number 2 and still climbing. And so they have put in place, the government has put in place procedures to get goods into the country that are essential to combating COVID-19. So I'm not talking just about PPE, personal protective equipment, or ventilators or respirators, certainly those, but others, anything that's essential to combating COVID-19, the government has lessened the restrictions, pulled back on some of the regulations, and made it easier. And in some cases, even in their customs regulations, which I'll talk about in a minute, but as you probably know, are very complicated. They've even scaled some of those back. So there are fewer customs regulations, import regulations on bringing in essential COVID-19 products. And in some cases, they've even lowered or eliminated the customs duties to bring in essential COVID-19 products because obviously they are in desperate need of those. So if you are exporting an essential COVID-19 product to Brazil, you might be in pretty good shape. It might be, you might find expedited processing and lower regulations for customs, and you might find your customs duties low, very low, or none at all. The problem is if you are trying to export non-essential COVID-19 products to Brazil, it's still those same old regulations in place. So that huge morass of customs regulations which are virtually impossible to understand, and those enormously high customs duties which Brazil has in place. For those of you who may be aware, the customs duties in Brazil can be 100%, 140%, 180% of the value of the product that you're trying to export, the purchase price of the product that's coming into Brazil. And so for non-COVID-19 essential products, it's still that huge morass of regulations and very high customs duties. And to make matters even worse, a lot of the resources are now going toward getting the essential COVID-19 products in as quickly as possible. So there's even a longer wait time for the non-essential COVID-19 processing for customs regulations and the like. But if you have a COVID-19 essential product, as I mentioned, you also need to be a little careful on US export controls and US export licenses, because as you might imagine, we're not so keen on letting you export essential COVID-19 products out of the United States. So where before the coronavirus, you may have had no problem exporting those products out of the United States, now you need to check to see if there are not export control restrictions on you shipping essential COVID-19 products and technology out of the United States, or maybe you need a US federal export license to do that. So where Brazil has made it easier for you to export those essential COVID-19 products into Brazil, the US government may have made it more difficult. So you have to watch both sides of that equation. Be careful with that. Movement of individuals. So just as we have shut our borders with Canada and Mexico. Likewise, Brazil has shut its borders completely to individuals. So it's not as if you can get on a plane and go to Brazil now. And I think, if my memory serves right, I think the restriction on border closings is until at least July 5th, which is actually only a couple of days from now. I'm not sure if they'll be going to be extending that or not, but at least for right now, it's up until July 5th. So that means at least for the time being, there's no visiting customers or clients or going to trade shows in Brazil, none of that. The border is basically closed. And if you are thinking or in the process of trying to do a joint venture in Brazil or set up a subsidiary in Brazil where you might be shipping your own American employees down there for an extended period of time to work on a joint venture or a subsidiary or some other major project, in addition, of course, to the immigration problem I just mentioned of crossing the border, if you need labor approvals to have your employees work in Brazil, the labor approvals are exceedingly slow and cut to a snail's pace because a lot of the resources are going toward getting the ministries involved in getting all of those essential COVID-19 products in. So even slower to get labor approvals, or for that matter, any type of government ministry approvals that don't relate to essential COVID-19 products and technology. So again, if you've got an essential COVID-19 product or technology, it's going to be easier. If you don't, if it's not essential to the battle with COVID-19, it's going to be slower. And so for things that we ordinarily see in deals with Brazil, American companies that want to do deals in Brazil, technology transfers are much slower getting approval out of government ministries. IP protection, like patent applications, that also much slower. Approvals for joint ventures, incorporation of subsidiaries, much slower, again, unless it relates to an essential COVID-19 product or technology. And with regard to the central bank approvals, which, as you may know, is often required to send money out of Brazil, so for you to get paid back in the United States, again, essential COVID-19 product or technology, faster and probably easier path. But if it's not an essential COVID-19 product or technology, again, slower, even slower than it ordinarily is to get central bank Brazil approval for payments out of the country. And then the final thing I want to mention is a trend we're seeing on economic issues. So before COVID-19 struck at the beginning of the year, in 2018 and 2019, Brazil had done a really great job of enticing foreign direct investment into the country. They had loosened the restrictions for bringing foreign direct investment into the country starting for a couple of years ago. They had done such a nice job that I think it was 2018 and maybe 2019, they ranked 4th in the world in bringing in foreign direct investment into Brazil. So they had the 4th largest foreign direct investment of any country in the world. And they did that because they had lowered capitalization requirements for doing joint ventures or incorporating subsidiaries that were going to do business in Brazil, made it easier to get loans as a foreign company to get loans in Brazil if you were going to do a joint venture with a Brazilian company or incorporate a subsidiary. And those regulations are still in place. The problem is that with all of the emphasis being on fighting COVID-19 and all of the government resources being funneled in that direction, people really aren't doing a whole lot of foreign direct investment in Brazil right now. And although those regulations are still on the books, we don't see a lot of activity in that direction, primarily because of the downturn in the economic situation in Brazil. And then finally, I just want to briefly mention labor protection. So when COVID-19 hit Brazil and the ensuing economic downturn, the government put in regulations which would not allow Brazilian companies to terminate employees. They made it more difficult. Now, of course, in the US, you probably know we have at-will employment. It's much easier to terminate an employee, and hence why we have, what's the latest number? 42 million people who have lost their jobs since the coronavirus hit. But in Brazil, it was harder to terminate employees to begin with, but now the legislature has put in even broader protections for employees so that employers have a tougher time terminating them during the coronavirus period. So there's more labor protection for Brazilian employees who can't work or are working only part-time. In Brazil, their jobs are more protected than they were before the coronavirus hit. And with that, I'll stop. Happy to take any questions, and I will pass the clicker over to Pat to talk about Colombia. Or I will try to pass the clicker to Pat.
Thanks, Rich. So I'm going to do my presentation today on Colombia. While Colombia is typically measures fourth in terms of the size of economy in Central South America, I think there's some better potential in Colombia just because it has a more business-friendly environment. Colombia ranked number 27 in total trade through April 2020. With a total of 8.6 billion. When you look at the figures for trade with Colombia, there really hasn't been much fall off, at least in the first quarter of this year. That is expected to change, and we'll see where that goes. Historically, Colombia imports more than it exports, although right now it has a surplus and is actually exporting more than it imports. Benefit to doing business there, U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. They're a member of the TPP. Top U.S. exports, mineral fuels, computers, electronics, machinery, organic chemicals, cereals, flowers, things of that sort. Recently, 2016, they entered into a peace settlement with the FARC guerrillas. That peace settlement was initially passed and then was renegotiated. It's slipping. Ivan Duque has taken a harder line with the FARC. They're rearming and there's some fighting in some areas. The administration is expecting that the economy will contract by about 5.5% during this year. The current situation on the ground, Colombia reports about 91,769 current coronavirus cases, I believe, as of a few days ago, with about 3,100 deaths. On March 31st, the U.S. Department of State issued a level 4 travel advisory warning U.S. citizens not to travel to Colombia unless they were prepared to be quarantined for at least 14 days and possibly not be able to return to the United States. I've got many friends and clients who have gone down to Colombia and were not able to get back. They had intended to come back in April, and at least one of them just got back last week. So it's hard to get a flight out. There are some humanitarian flights, but be very careful. Right now, it's almost impossible to get into the country, and it's almost impossible to get out. Colombia has a national quarantine in place now until July 15th. That is the 6th extension of the quarantine there. They do, as in Mexico and as in Brazil, look at essential businesses. As of March 17, the Colombian Department of Labor ordered businesses to have all workers work from home who could work from home. The exception was those who were involved in essential industries who were allowed to go into work, taking into account WHO guidance and sanitary and social distancing guidance. The federal government initially ordered a countrywide stay-at-home order, but is now giving much more autonomy to mayors and local authorities who are able to assess the situation on the ground and determine whether there is a high incidence of cases or whether they can loosen up the restrictions. Of course, Bogota and the surrounding metropolitan area is where most of the cases are. There's been an uptick in cases there, and the mayor has just indicated that she wants to see more strict guidance again, or more strict quarantining, and she's urging that for the federal government as well. With respect to essential businesses, the government has allowed essential manufacturing and construction to operate, but again with sanitary measures and with social distancing, and with the understanding that those personnel who can work from home will work from home. Failure to implement sanitary and social distancing measures can result in criminal prosecution, though I have not heard of any actual criminal cases being brought. Restaurants and bars are still limited operations, takeout. Some have opened, some have then reclosed. Gatherings are still restricted, so many of the restrictions that you see in place in the United States are in place in Colombia as well. Colombia has a lot of open food markets. Many of those had opened, and then the country saw a huge spike in cases involving those food markets, and so many of those have closed again. With respect to the transportation of people and goods in and out of the country, as I said, international passenger flights are still restricted. Those are restricted until further notice. I believe they had indicated July, but I expect that will extend. Domestic flights were also severely restricted until July 1st, but again, I believe they will extend those for areas where there's a high number of cases. They've been having humanitarian flights, and there's going to be another one on July 1st. One of the discount airlines from the United States, Spirit, had done a couple of flights out of Colombia during June. Avianca is doing this one in July. International air freight is operating between the U.S. and Colombia with about a 30 to 40% reduction, and obviously delays which are due to reduced personnel and some additional difficulties just with backlog. Ocean freight operating normally, expect delays in processing, again due to reduced personnel. Cross-border land freight is restricted with delays, but domestic land freight is generally operating normally. The borders have been closed with Venezuela and Ecuador. I believe Ecuador is now opened up, but even with Venezuela, they're still only allowing passage for food and essential items. I'm not going to spend too much time on contracts and force majeure. I think what Luis and Rich said is very similar to what is happening in Colombia. The principles of civil law are pretty much the same in all of these countries. They borrow from the same sources. There are two kinds of concepts in Colombia, as Luis indicated in Mexico. There's force majeure and fortuitous events. Force majeure events are those which apply and affect everyone. In order for a force majeure event to excuse a party's performance, it has to be external, unpredictable, and irresistible. There is obviously a hard-baked provision in the Civil Code. You can also change that in your contract. Colombia recognizes freedom of contract up to the extent that it doesn't violate public policy. We're seeing a lot of cases of people relying upon breaches of agreements or failure to perform based on force majeure that works and has worked to a certain extent. I think everybody, as Luis said, understands the circumstances, but once the pandemic hit and people were seeing what was coming around the corner, it's difficult to keep pushing this as an excuse for non-performance. So again, I haven't seen very many cases. The system in Colombia is very slow, but I think it's going to be hard to rely on this for much longer. Interestingly enough, while it would seem to fit perfectly within the Civil Code definition, the Colombian Ministry of Labor has said that the coronavirus pandemic is not a force majeure event that excuses an employer for enacting mass layoffs. And there's some contradiction in terms of general statements from the government with respect to other commercial areas and what they're saying about labor guidelines. So what's happening in the labor area? Employers have a duty to train employees on sanitary and social distancing practices, heavy emphasis on training videos, etc. 14-day quarantine for anybody who's infected or has come into contact with somebody who's infected. And obviously, if you're infected, you can't come back until you've had 14 days of no symptoms. Testing is spotty in Colombia, but ideally, if you can get a test and then wait 14 days to come back, that's the best situation. Employees must notify Health Ministry of coronavirus infections. They must implement flexible work hours to avoid large numbers of employees coming in and out of facilities at the same time. Decreasing face-to-face meetings, providing disinfectant gels, PPEs, and plastic barriers. So many of the things that we're seeing here in the United States. Employer-implemented quarantines and temporary suspensions of operations. What Luis had talked about with respect to Mexico is very much the case in Colombia. People are trying to take a practical account, and they're trying to work out reasonable terms with employees. But if an employer's operation shuts down temporarily or permanently, the employer may suspend the employment contracts, which is somewhat different than in Mexico, based on implementation of force majeure or unforeseen event. Complex rules apply. The Ministry of Labor is taking kind of a hard stance on this, and they're still expecting that employers will pay salaries, Social Security, and health and pension funds. As a practical matter, that of course isn't happening everywhere. Excuse me. With respect to layoffs, if employers conduct layoffs, employers are entitled to the statutory severance, which is for most employees 15 days prior written notice, accrued but unpaid salary, bonus, vacation aguinaldo, as well as severance equal to 20 days for the first year of service and 15 days for each year of service thereafter. Tax relief, extended deadlines for filing and paying federal direct tax, as well as extensions in the municipalities for prediales or real estate taxes, extended deadlines for VAT payments for on-site sales of food and alcoholic beverages, and activities of travel agencies and tour operators, which are, of course, among some of the hardest businesses hit by this virus and by the crisis. On June 3rd, the President signed Decree 770 of 2020, providing tax relief measures due to the coronavirus pandemic, exempting VAT for financial institution fund transfers, providing monthly financial assistance of $44.36, which of course doesn't seem much like much to us, but is at least something for workers who don't have many resources. They're also requiring employers to make premiums in 3 installments, and they are establishing a procedure to obtain economic benefits. With respect to customs, as Rich indicated, customs has been operating generally on time and as normal in Colombia, but because of reductions in personnel, of course, there's been some delays. There is for a 6-month period, a 0% customs duty rate applying on important goods that are needed for the COVID epidemic. And of course, as in the United States and other countries, there is a ban on exportation of certain goods that are needed in the country to battle the pandemic. And as indicated by my colleagues, there are delays in administrative proceedings. Court proceedings are not taking place with person-to-person contact So those kinds of things will be delayed for the foreseeable future. And that is the end of my presentation. If you have some questions, we would love to address your questions.
Thank you, gentlemen. And as you'll see on your screen now, as I indicated at the beginning of the presentation, if you have the LinkedIn app, not only will you see the contact information for each of the presenters here, but on your LinkedIn app, there is a great opportunity to connect with each of the presenters on LinkedIn, and this is also something that you can use in your own presentations or in networking opportunities. If you open the LinkedIn app and look in the search bar at the top of the screen to the far right, you will see 3 squares and an X. Upon clicking that, you will find that it opens a QR code scanner. You may have to give access to your camera through LinkedIn, but once you do that, if you hold your camera or your phone, the screener up to the screen and hover over the QR codes for each of the presenters, it will take you directly to their LinkedIn profile where you can connect, send notes, but basically get connected with them through LinkedIn. So this is a wonderful networking opportunity, something to use later on in your own presentations or in networking opportunities for yourself. We do have several questions that did come in, and we will address as many of those as we can with the time that we have left. For any questions that we do not address, we will download the chat and the Q&A as well to make sure that we follow up with you as soon as possible for answers to your questions. So the first question is for Luis. Is the stoplight system that you indicated earlier, is that being clearly advertised, communicated, and or enforced? And can you confirm that this is being clearly advertised or enforced?
That's a great question. So it has been, everybody knows about, well, I shouldn't say everybody, but it's been pretty well advertised. But it's the enforcement has been spotty, because what happened is that system was supposed to come into effect on June 1st. And surprise, surprise, on June 1st, the whole country was on red. So it was like we were before, where only essential businesses could continue operating. So now it really depends on the state where you are conducting business and the activity that you are trying to conduct. Most of the enforcement now has been left to the states, although the Federal Ministry of Labor is still conducting inspections when they receive reports of violations by employees. But for the most part, again, it's left to the states. And again, I'm sorry that I don't have a more concrete answer, but it really now depends on where you are and what is it that you are trying to do.
And our next question is for Rich regarding Brazil contracts and courts. Can you clarify if an agreement is singed using the laws of the USA? Could any claims not be done here in the USA with Brazilian companies in default?
That's correct. They cannot. You can, of course, if you so desire, because it's governed by the laws of the United States, try to get the Brazilian defendant to come to the United States. And even if you're successful there, it's extremely difficult to enforce an American court decree in Brazil. So even before the coronavirus hit, this was a question that we received all the time. And because it's so difficult to enforce an American court decree in Brazil, oftentimes we suggest that you unfortunately go to Brazil to file a lawsuit, unless, of course, the Brazilian company has assets outside of Brazil that you might be able to attack if you were to win an American court decree and go to a third jurisdiction, a third country, where those Brazilian company assets are located, and try to enforce your American court decree in that country. Otherwise, it is and remains extremely difficult to enforce an American court decree in Brazil.
I just want to add a little bit to that. In all of these countries, arbitrations are recognized, and I would urge clients to consider arbitration clauses in agreements from now going forward. I am wondering whether or not arbitration clauses are now going to provide for arbitrations to take place by video link. It would certainly seem to me to be something that would be prudent to try to implement and see if it flies, because one of the obvious problems we're having is the inability of parties to get access to the courts because of restrictions in face-to-face hearings and meetings, et cetera.
Yeah, so what Pat says is right. Generally, much easier to initiate an arbitration than arbitration tribunal, and that will be enforced in the country where the arbitration is located.
Thank you, gentlemen. Another question for you, Rich. Has the common external tariff been increased in recent times? And a follow-up, have state-by-state value-added taxes increased or decreased?
Okay, the state value-added taxes have increased over time. And what was the, sorry, what was the first part of the question?
Sure. So the first part of the question was, has the common external tariff been increased in recent times?
I don't know the answer to that. Do either of you know the answer to that for Brazil? I don't. You know, whoever that is, I'm happy to look it up and I'll send you an email with the answer to that question.
Okay, moving along. How does, and this is for Rich as well, how does the education and community service sector or nonprofit fit within your essential product technology definition in Brazil?
So profit or nonprofit, there is a set of regulations which defines what are essential COVID-19 products and technology, and whether you are profit or nonprofit, if you fit within those services or those product categories, then you are more likely to get your products processed on an expedited basis to get into Brazil, or your technology if it's a technology transfer. So it's not an issue of profit, a for-profit company versus a not-for-profit company. It's whether you're on the list, or whether a description of the services you intend to provide or the goods you intend to import into Brazil are on a list of definitions which constitute essential COVID-19 products and technology.
Excellent. And we have a couple of other questions that we will make sure that our presenters get the copies of those questions to follow up with you afterwards as we are at time. But we want to thank you all for attending today's webinar, and we want to thank our presenters for educating us on these different impactful situations in the various countries. If you have any additional questions for any of these presenters, again, their contact information is on the screen. And we will thank you now for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar through Frederickson and Byron.